Hi quilty friends, I'm Natalia Bonner back with another portion of this cute fancy forest quilt. I hope that you've been enjoying this series. Leave a comment and let me know if you have been. Your feedback is kind of what fuels what I put on here. Obviously my clients' quilts totally drive the content that I share on here. But if you like these types of things, then maybe I'll share more. But if you do want more in-depth videos like I've been sharing with this cute fancy forest quilt, make sure you check out my Patreon page. Over on Patreon, I share more in-depth videos where I walk you through kind of my thought process and teach you and show you more kind of about my insight into my machine quilting. So make sure you check that out. It's patreon.com/Natalia Bonner. But let's get today's video. Today I'm sharing the Thistle block. I don't know if that's what it's actually called in the quilt pattern because it's not my pattern. I haven't made this quilt before. This is a client's quilt, so I'm calling it the Thistle block. That's what it reminds me of. So on this particular block, I decided to do a little bit of kind of traditional work with the feathers and then also a bit of modern work with the straight lines quilted in the leaves on the quilt. I don't feel like feathers necessarily always have to be quilted just on traditional quilts. I feel like they can be quilted on more modern quilts like this particular quilt. You'll see it when we get to the video. But before we get to the video, just a few business things. I do all of my machine quilting on the Gamble 22-inch machine. You can see it right there. All of my machine quilting is done in the stitch regulated mode, and I generally am stitching between 10 and 12 stitches per inch. The thread that I'm using on this particular quilt is so fine. The color is Pearl, the number is 402. That's what I'm using on the top. And then on my bobbin, I'm using bottom line thread, which is also by Superior Threads. Obviously, I'm going to use my 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler because I love it, and I have one layer of Quilter's Dream wool batting on this quilt. So all of those products, if you're interested in any of those, are available on my website, peaceandquilt.com. Let's get to the video. As I'm quilting any quilt block, I like to, work left to right across my quilt because I am doing all the quilting on the long arm. I start on the left-hand side of the quilt and work my way across. If it's a quilt like this where I'm using just one color of thread, which obviously I'm doing here, then I try to quilt as continuous line as I possibly can. So if you watch closely here, you can see that I've gone around this thistle block and added that 1/4-inch line around the outside. I love that outside echo, the way that it helps me separate background fillers from the block designs. And I also love the look of stitch in the ditch. So I will work back and forth, outlining, then doing a bit of background filler, and just kind of working my way across the design. I don't have a set rule that, I always have to stitch in the ditch first or whatever. My kind of rule of thumb is to quilt as much as is in my throat space as I possibly can, and then move on from there. The other thing that you'll probably notice here when I move on and start stitching in the ditch around this design, I just used the pieced seam line as kind of my little cheater. That's how I travel over and start stitching those designs. So using a really fine thread is very helpful when it comes to backtracking, things like that. You don't end up with a lot of thread buildup like you would with a heavier thread. So in the top portion of this thistle, I chose to quilt feathers. Now I'm stitching a fun bump back feather here. If you've never quilted feathers, I highly recommend checking out my book, Visual Guide to Free Motion Quilting Feathers. In that book, I do walk you step by step through machine quilting feathers, several different feather designs, and hopefully inspire you to quilt more feathers. So here, obviously you can see that I'm quilting half of the feather. I'm making it appear as if it's coming from the center and kind of bursting out from there. So I'll just focus on half at a time. The bump back feather is a great, really nice feather design. Obviously there's lots of ways that you can quilt feathers, but this is just the method I'm choosing to use on this design. I use the stitch in the ditch as my travel, so you can see when I start out a feather, I'll stitch my feather and then stitch in the ditch back down to the start to start the next feather. Using my 4-in-1 machine quilting ruler to travel down that, I do have a piece of the Westerly stable tape on the back of my ruler. That helps me just have a little bit more control over my ruler, keep it a little bit more secure. Like I mentioned, I do have all these products that I talk about available on my website, pieceandquilt.com. Now when I move down, working further down the thistle, in that center small portion that's right under kind of the flower portion, I guess it's called, of the thistle, I'm going to just machine quilt a straight line of pebbles. I feel like it adds a little bit of extra, just something soft to that little area. But also the really nice thing is I've done that same little element in some other places on this quilt. So I'm now not only tying the elements on the blocks, like the 1/2 inch spacing, things like that I've done on several of the other blocks, but I'm also tying those little circles that I've done on some of the other blocks into this thistle block. So everything looks like it goes together. Now when I move on to these leaves, yeah, this quilt is a little bit more on the modern side. So I decided to do a fun straight line point-to-point filler on the inside of those leaves. I didn't do any marking here. There's no actual reference lines, anything like that. It was just looking at it, visualizing, and saying, that looks pretty good. So my machine quilting's not always perfect, but it looks pretty good. I hope this little video inspired you. Make sure to check out my Patreon page like I mentioned, and have a great day, everybody.